When I walked through the door of that courtroom, the world seemed to stop. The judge looked up from his papers, and his eyes locked onto me with an expression I will never forget. His face transformed in seconds, shifting from professional concentration to something bordering on astonishment, almost fear. His lips parted, and I heard him whisper, as if the words were escaping him without permission. "Who are you?" The entire room turned toward me. I felt the weight of all those stares, some confused, others curious, and one in particular, that of my daughter-in-law, Chloe, which turned pale as wax. Her mother, Victoria, sitting next to her with that air of superiority that always characterized her, frowned, trying to understand what was happening. I saw them look at each other, first with bewilderment, then with something that looked like contained terror. My son, David, sitting at the defense table with his shoulders slumped and his gaze lost, turned slowly. When our eyes met, I saw tears rolling down his cheeks. I said nothing. I simply walked toward him, my steps echoing in the absolute silence of that room, and placed my hand on his shoulder. It was then that everything began to change. But to understand how I arrived at that moment, I must go back in time. I must take you to my home, to that quiet life I had carefully built over the last 15 years. A simple life, far from the noise and the lights that once surrounded me. My home has always been a refuge of peace. It is located on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by ancient trees whose branches sway gently in the breeze. Every morning I wake up to the sound of birdsong, that pure sound that reminds me there is beauty in simplicity. My routine is predictable, comforting. I brew chamomile tea in my white ceramic teapot, the same one I have used for 20 years. The sweet aroma fills the kitchen as I watch through the window how the dawn light tints the garden in shades of gold and rose. I am 70 years old, and every one of those years is reflected in the lines on my face, in my hands that tremble slightly when I hold the hot cup. But there is something else about me, something that most people would never notice seeing me on the street. Something I kept locked away, hidden, protected for so long that I almost forgot it existed. My days pass between my little herb garden and my books. I have an entire library in my study, old volumes with worn spines that I have read and reread countless times. I like to spend my afternoons there, with the curtains partially drawn, letting in shafts of light that illuminate the dust suspended in the air. It smells of old paper, of wood, and of time standing still. It is my sanctuary. The neighbors know me as Mrs. Harrison, the kind elderly woman who grows rosemary and basil, who greets them with a soft smile and rarely receives visitors. Some bring me homemade bread. Others ask for advice on plants. No one asks about my past. No one knows who I was before I became this silent version of myself. My son David comes to visit me every 2 weeks, always with his children, my 2 precious grandchildren, aged 8 and 10. They run through the yard, chase butterflies, ask me to tell them stories while we eat oatmeal cookies on the porch. They are my greatest joy, the reason I still believe in the goodness of the world. David is a good man. He works as an engineer, makes good money, and has always been responsible and loving with his children. But 2 years ago, his marriage fell apart. Chloe, his wife, left him overnight, taking the children and moving into her family's home. A powerful family, full of money and connections, accustomed to getting everything they want, regardless of who they have, to crush in the process. Since then, David has fought to maintain joint custody. He has spent all his savings on lawyers, endured humiliations and mediations, and cried in my kitchen more times than I can count. I have consoled him, made him tea, and told him everything would be okay. But deep down, I felt injustice growing inside me like a dark shadow. Chloe changed. Or perhaps she was always like that and I just refused to see it. She became cruel, calculating, using the children as weapons, putting ideas in their heads, telling them their father did not love them. And her family, especially her mother Victoria, backed every lie, every manipulation. They had the money to hire the best lawyers, to bribe witnesses, to build a false narrative where David was the villain. I watched it all from my small house, feeling rage mixed with helplessness. But I did nothing. Because I had decided long ago that that part of my life was over. That the power I once held no longer belonged to me. That I should remain in the shadows, invisible, irrelevant. Until I received that call. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was watering my lavender plants when the phone rang. David's voice on the other end of the line was barely a broken whisper, choked with sobs. "Mom," he said. And in that single word, I heard all his pain. I lost. The judge ruled that Chloe gets full custody. I can only see my kids one weekend a month. They lied, Mom. They said horrible things about me and nobody believed me. Her lawyer humiliated me in front of everyone. Chloe was laughing. Her whole family was laughing at me. I closed my eyes. I felt something inside me, something that had been dormant for 15 years, begin to awaken. It was as if a sealed door was slowly creaking open, letting out a force I had forgotten I possessed. "When is the next hearing?" I asked. And my voice sounded different, even to me. Firmer, colder. "In 3 days," David replied through his tears. "But there's nothing left to do, Mom. They won." I hung up the phone and stood motionless in the middle of my garden. The sun was beginning to set, staining the sky orange and violet. I felt the earth beneath my feet, the cool air on my face, the steady beat of my heart. And I made a decision. I went into my house and walked directly to my study. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I never touch, where I keep the things that belong to another version of me. I pulled out a worn folder and opened it with trembling hands. There they were. All those documents, those photographs, those memories of who I used to be, my doctorate in constitutional law, my awards, letters from my students, the newspaper articles where my name was mentioned with respect, almost with reverence. I ran my fingers over an old photograph where I appeared in my robes, serious and powerful, surrounded by magistrates. On the back, someone had written, "Justice Eleanor Prescott, the most brilliant mind in the judicial system." I took a deep breath. It was time to remind the world who I was. And 3 days later, I walked through that courtroom door. Judge Julian Vance's gaze was still fixed on me, and I could see his mind working frantically, trying to process what he was seeing. I knew him, not personally, but I knew who he was. He had been my student 25 years ago, one of the best of his generation. I remembered his young, eager face, always sitting in the front row of my civil procedure class, taking notes with a dedication few possessed. Now he was the one presiding over this room, the one with the power to decide the future of my son and grandchildren. And in his eyes, I saw recognition. I saw the pieces click into place in his memory. Professor Prescott. Justice Prescott. The woman who had written 3 of the textbooks he had undoubtedly studied. The woman whose signature had validated judgments that changed the country's jurisprudence. I slowly removed the gray coat I was wearing and folded it carefully over the back of the chair next to David. I was wearing a simple olive green dress, nothing ostentatious, but dignified. My white hair was pulled back in a low bun, and I wore no jewelry other than a pair of silver earrings my husband gave me decades ago. I did not need to look powerful. True power is not worn, it is breathed. Chloe watched me from her table, her eyes narrowed, trying to understand what was happening. I had only seen her a handful of times during her marriage to David. She had always been polite to me, but distant, as if I were simply an irrelevant accessory in her life, an unimportant, elderly mother-in-law. I never told her about my past. I never felt the need to impress her or explain who I had been. Now, seeing her there in her expensive cream-colored suit and her expression of superiority, I was glad I had remained silent all those years. Her lawyer, a burly man in his 50s with a black suit that seemed too tight, leaned toward her and whispered something in her ear. Chloe shook her head, clearly confused. Her mother, Victoria, sitting in the front row behind them, looked at me with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. She was used to being the most important woman in any room she entered. Her family owned a chain of car dealerships across the state. They had properties valued in the millions of dollars, and she used that power like a hammer, crushing anyone who got in her way. But today, something had changed in the atmosphere of that room. And she felt it, even if she did not understand why. Judge Vance cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he began, and his voice trembled slightly. "Could you please identify yourself for the record?" I smiled. It was a small smile, barely a movement at the corners of my lips, but it was loaded with meaning. Of course, Your Honor. My name is Eleanor Mercedes Prescott. I am the mother of the defendant, David Harrison. There was a silence. Then, the judge added, almost unable to help himself, Doctor. Eleanor Prescott? The former Justice of the State Supreme Court? The very same, I replied in a calm voice. The impact was immediate. I heard murmurs in the courtroom. Chloe's lawyer straightened abruptly in his chair. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes wide. And Chloe, my dear former daughter-in-law, turned even paler, if that was possible. My son looked at me with astonishment. He knew I had been a lawyer, that I had worked in the judicial system, but I never told him the details. I never told him about the important cases I had handled, the times my name appeared in the headlines, the lectures I gave at universities across the continent. To him, I had always been just Mom, the woman who baked cookies and grew herbs in her garden. And that was exactly what I wanted. Until now. Judge Vance seemed unsure how to proceed. Justice Prescott, it is an honor to have you in my courtroom. I must confess, I studied your texts throughout my entire career. Your analysis on due process in Fernandez versus the state is still required reading. I nodded gracefully. I am glad to know my contributions still have relevance. And I am even more glad to know that you are presiding over this case, Judge Vance. I always knew you would go far. You were exceptional in my class. I saw his cheeks color slightly. Chloe's lawyer shot to his feet. Your Honor, with all due respect, I do not understand what relevance this has to the case. The lady can be whoever she is, but that does not change the facts presented. I turned toward him slowly. I held his gaze until I saw him look away. I had not said a single word directly to him, but the message was clear. He had picked the wrong opponent. Judge Vance regained his professional composure. You are correct, Counselor. Let us proceed with the hearing. He looked at me. Justice Prescott, do you wish to represent your son in this hearing? No, Your Honor, I replied calmly. I have not practiced law in 15 years. I am simply here as a mother, as an observer, and as someone who knows very well how justice works, or how it should work. Those last words hung in the air like a veiled warning. The judge understood them. I knew he would. I sat down next to David, who was still looking at me as if he could not believe what he was witnessing. I squeezed his hand gently. It was cold, trembling. Everything is going to be okay, I whispered. Trust me. The hearing resumed, but the energy had completely shifted. Chloe's lawyer, who minutes before had been confident and arrogant, now seemed nervous. He shuffled his papers more often than necessary, and his voice had lost that crushing certainty he had surely used to humiliate my son in previous hearings. Chloe kept glancing at me, out of the corner of her eye. I could see the questions forming in her mind. Who was her ex-mother-in-law? Really? Why did she never know? What did this mean for her case? Victoria, for her part, had taken out her cell phone and was typing frantically, probably searching my name on the internet, trying to understand who she had crossed. I smiled to myself. Let her search. Let her read. Let her discover every article, every ruling, every case where my name shone like a beacon of unwavering justice. Because this was just the beginning. I had spent 15 years in silence, tending my garden and pretending the outside world no longer mattered. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had touched my son. They had hurt my grandchildren. And now I was back. And when Eleanor Prescott returned, the entire system trembled. The judge continued with the formal procedures, but I was no longer just listening. My mind was working, analyzing, remembering everything I had learned in 40 years of my career. I knew every loophole, every procedure, every appeal that could be used. And more importantly, I knew people. Important people. People who owed me favors. People who would remember my name with respect, and in some cases, with fear. I took a small notebook from my purse and began taking notes. Every inconsistency in the other side's arguments. Every time Chloe's lawyer exaggerated or misrepresented the facts. Every moment where procedure was not followed exactly as it should be. David watched me write, and for the first time in months, I saw something like hope illuminating his tired eyes. Yes, my son, I thought, as my pen glided across the paper. Your mother is back, and this time, no one will ever hurt you again. That night, after the hearing ended with no definitive resolutions but a completely transformed atmosphere, I drove back to my house in silence. David had tried to ask me questions, but I asked him to wait. I needed to think. I needed to process. I needed to become, if only temporarily, the woman I had once been. I arrived well after the sun had set. My porch lights flickered softly, illuminating the stone path to my door. I went inside, left my keys on the entryway table, and walked directly to my study. I did not turn on many lights. Just the desk lamp, that old brass lamp with the green shade that had been my companion through countless nights of studying and preparing cases. I sat in my worn leather chair and opened my laptop, one of the few concessions to modern technology I had allowed myself in these years of retirement. My fingers, though wrinkled and spotted with age, still remembered how to type quickly. I searched my name on the internet, just as I was sure Chloe and Victoria had done. The results appeared by the dozens, pages and pages of articles, academic references, historic rulings. There was the Clear Creek case, where I defended the constitutional rights of an indigenous community against a multi-billion-dollar mining corporation. There was Patterson versus Patterson, where I set the precedent on joint custody that was still used in law schools. There was my photograph from 20 years ago, dressed in my robes, serious and firm, on the cover of a legal journal with the headline, "The Iron Justice, Eleanor Prescott and Her Unbreakable Legacy." I smiled bitterly. The Iron Justice. That is what they called me. Not because I was cruel, but because I was impossible to bend. Because when I made a decision based on the law and justice, nothing and no one could make me change my mind. Not money, not threats, not political pressure. That reputation had cost me everything. I had lost friendships. I had received death threats. I had lived with a police escort for years. And finally, tired of the constant war, I had decided to retire, to disappear, to become a ghost of my own legend. But ghosts can return when necessary. I closed the laptop and opened the top drawer of my desk. Inside was an old black leather-bound address book, the pages yellowed with time. I opened it carefully. It was full of names, phone numbers, addresses, some crossed out because those people were no longer with us. But many others were still active. Colleagues, former students, judges, prosecutors, lawyers who had worked with me, journalists who covered my most important cases. I ran my fingers over the names, remembering faces and voices. Maxwell Chen. He had been my clerk for 5 years, a brilliant young man with a sense of justice as strong as mine. Now he was a partner at one of the most prestigious firms in the country. Caroline Reeves, a former student who had followed in my footsteps and was now a family court judge on the appellate division. Sam Costello, a private investigator who had helped me unravel complex fraud in impossible cases. I picked up my landline phone, that old device that felt heavy and real in my hand, so different from modern cell phones. I dialed the first number. It was almost 9 o'clock in the evening, but I knew Maxwell would still be at his office. He had always been a workaholic. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Chen, Lee, and Associates. Maxwell Chen speaking. Maxwell, I said simply. This is Eleanor Prescott. There was a long silence. So long I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard his voice, incredulous, almost broken with emotion. Justice Prescott? Is it really you? It has been, my God, it must be 15 years. I thought I would never hear from you again. I have been living quietly, Maxwell. Retired, at peace. But something has happened that requires my attention. I need your help. Anything, he replied without a second's hesitation. You know I owe you everything I am. Tell me what you need. I explained David's situation. I told him about Chloe, about her family, about the injustice that was happening. I told him about the lies, about how they had manipulated the system, about how my son was losing his children not because he was a bad father, but because the other side had more money and fewer scruples. Maxwell listened in silence, and when I finished, his voice was hard as steel. I know the family, the Salazars, right? Owners of Salazar Motors. They have a reputation for being ruthless. They have bought judges before, They have sunk competitors' businesses using questionable methods. But, Justice, if you are involved, they have no idea who they just messed with. I need you to investigate everything about them, I said. Their finances, their businesses, their contacts, everything that could be relevant, and I need absolute discretion. No one can know I am behind this yet. Understood. I will have a full report for you in 48 hours. I hung up and dialed the next number. Caroline answered on the second ring. Reeves. Caroline. It is Eleanor Prescott. A sharp intake of breath. Professor? I cannot believe it. Is it really you? I smiled, despite the seriousness of the moment. Caroline had always been expressive, passionate. It is me, dear. How have you been? Good, Professor. Very good. I am a family court judge now, thanks to everything you taught me. But you disappeared. We all wondered what had happened to you. I decided to retire and live in peace. But now I need to consult you on something. Off the record, it is about a custody case involving my son. I told her the details, the names, the dates. Caroline listened with professional attention. Judge Vance is good, she said finally. He was your student, wasn't he? He has a reputation for being fair, but also for being cautious. He does not like to make trouble with powerful families. But if you are there, if he knows you are watching, I can guarantee he will follow the law to the letter. No one wants to look bad in front of Justice Prescott. I hope so, but I need more than his caution. I need real justice. You will have it, Professor. If there is something shady in that case, and with the Salazar family there probably is, I can make a few discreet calls. Check if there are prior complaints, inconsistencies in their filings. Leave it to me. I spoke with 3 more people that night. Each conversation reconnected me with a part of myself that had been asleep. Each name I dialed brought back memories of battles won, of injustices corrected, of voices I had helped amplify when no one else would listen. When I finally hung up the last call, it was past 11 o'clock at night. I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and went out onto the back porch. The night air was cool and smelled of damp earth. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky. I sat in my old rocking chair, the one that creaked with every movement, and closed my eyes. For 15 years, I had believed I had left that world behind, that I had hung up my robe forever, that Dr. Eleanor Prescott, the Iron Justice, had died and in her place was simply Eleanor, the grandmother who grew herbs and baked cookies. But I had been wrong. That woman had never died. She had only been waiting for the right moment to return. And that moment had arrived when they touched my son, when they hurt my grandchildren, when the injustice became so great that I could no longer ignore it. I opened my eyes and looked up at the sky. Forgive me, I whispered, though I was not sure who I was speaking to. Perhaps to my late husband, who had always begged me to find peace. Perhaps to myself, for breaking the promise to stay away. But I cannot stand by and do nothing, not this time. A soft breeze moved the leaves of the trees, creating a whisper that sounded almost like a reply, almost like a blessing. I drank the last sip of my tea, now cold, and went back inside. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, I would start weaving the web that would trap Chloe and her family in their own lies, and I would do it with the precision and patience that only 40 years of experience can provide. Because if I had learned anything in my long career, it was this. Justice is not always swift, but when it is executed correctly, it is absolutely devastating. 2 days later, Maxwell showed up at my door with a black leather briefcase and an expression that mixed professionalism with something resembling predatory satisfaction. I invited him in and made coffee. That ritual that always preceded important conversations. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the natural light streaming through the open windows, and he placed the briefcase on the coffee table. Justice, he began, opening the latch with a metallic click. What I found is even more interesting than I expected. The Salazar family has an impeccable facade, but when you scratch just a little, the paint peels. He pulled out a thick folder full of documents. My heart beat faster. That old adrenaline rush from when I was about to discover the key piece of a case. Maxwell spread several papers on the table, organizing them methodically. Let's start with the basics, he said. Salazar Motors reports annual revenues of approximately $50 million. They have 8 dealerships in the state. Victoria Salazar is the matriarch who controls everything since her husband died 10 years ago. She is known for being ruthless in business. I knew that much, I commented, taking a sip of coffee. Tell me something I do not know. Maxwell smiled. For the last 3 years, they have been under an IRS investigation for tax irregularities. Nothing concrete yet, but there are signs they launder money through fictitious sales. Furthermore, there are 7 labor lawsuits from former employees alleging wrongful termination and workplace harassment. All were settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. I nodded, taking mental notes. And Chloe specifically? That is where it gets interesting. Justice. Chloe Salazar has never formally worked. She appears on the company payroll as a corporate image consultant with a salary of $200,000 annually, but there is no evidence she actually does anything. It is basically a way to transfer her company money without paying proper taxes. Tax fraud, I murmured. Go on. She has 3 corporate credit cards that she uses for personal expenses. Last month, she spent $45,000 on clothes, restaurants, and a trip to Miami with her friends, all billed as corporate representation expenses. Point. Maxwell paused and looked at me directly. And this is the best part, Justice. I found records of her visiting a rehabilitation center 2 years ago. 30 days inpatient for addiction to prescription anxiety medication. I looked up sharply. Addiction to medication? And this did not come out in the custody trial? Of course not. They paid the clinic to keep the records completely private. They used a false identity for admission. But I have a contact who worked there and remembered the case because the Salazar family made a huge scene, demanding VIP treatment and absolute confidentiality. My mind began working at high speed. A mother with a history of substance addiction, who was also committing tax fraud and living off money from a company under investigation. And during the trial, her lawyer had painted David as an unstable father while she appeared as the perfect mother. Is there more? I asked, though from Maxwell's expression, I knew there was. Chloe's lawyer, Gregory King, has a questionable reputation. He has won several cases using aggressive tactics and, according to rumors in the guild, is no stranger to witness tampering. 5 years ago, he was investigated by the Bar Association for alleged fabrication of evidence, but the case was closed due to lack of evidence. Curiously, the lawyer who accused him withdrew his complaint after receiving a significant sum of money. How much? $100,000. Direct bank transfer. It is all documented, only no one bothered to investigate further. I leaned back in my chair, processing all the information. It was like assembling a puzzle where each piece revealed a clearer picture of corruption and manipulation. But I needed to be careful. I could not just present this information in court without the right strategy. I needed it to look like they were unmasking themselves, that their lies were crumbling under their own weight. Maxwell, I need you to do something else. I want you to discreetly contact the IRS investigator in charge of the Salazar case. Do not say anything about me. Just mention that you have relevant information about financial irregularities related to a child custody case. That the children might be benefiting from money of questionable origin. Maxwell took notes quickly. Anything else, Justice? Yes. I need certified copies of all those documents. And I want the name of the contact at the rehabilitation center. I am going to need a testimony, eventually. You will have it in 24 hours. After Maxwell left, I called Sam Costello, the private investigator. He was a man of 60, with the appearance of a harmless grandfather, but the cunning of a fox. He had worked with me on cases where we needed evidence that official channels could not or would not obtain. Justice Prescott, he said when he answered, his voice raspy from years of smoking. I heard rumors you were back. I did not believe it until now. The rumors are true, Sam. I need your services. For you to the ends of the earth. What do you need? I want discreet surveillance on Chloe Salazar. I need to know who she meets, where she goes, what she does. I especially want to know how she treats her children when she thinks no one is watching. Photos, videos if possible, but nothing illegal. Everything must be obtained in public spaces. Understood. How long? 1 week should be enough. And Sam, I need you to find out about the lawyer, Gregory King, his movements, his contacts, especially any meetings with the Salazar family outside of a professional context. Dinners, social events, anything that suggests their relationship goes beyond purely legal. Consider it done, Justice. I will send you daily reports. That afternoon, while watering my rosemary plants, my phone rang. It was Caroline. Professor, I found something. It is not official yet, but there is a complaint filed 6 months ago. A teacher at the children's school reported concern about the older son's emotional state. She said he came to class visibly anxious, that he mentioned his mother yelled a lot, and that she sometimes punished him by withholding meals. My heart clenched. The complaint was superficially investigated by social services, but it was closed because the Salazar family presented letters from 2 private psychologists certifying that the children were perfectly fine. I felt the rage rise in my chest. Paid psychologists. Almost certainly, both have worked for wealthy families in similar cases before. They are known for writing favorable reports for whoever pays the most. I need that teacher's name, and I need a copy of that original complaint. I already have it all, Professor. I will send it by courier tonight. When I hung up, I stood in my garden, feeling the afternoon sun on my face. My plants grew strong and healthy because I cared for them patiently, watered them constantly, protected them from pests. This case was no different. It needed patience, constant care, and the determination to protect what was important. David stopped by to visit me that night. He looked better than the last time, less defeated. He sat with me on the porch as dusk fell. "Mom," he said softly, "you never told me you were so important. I looked up your name on the internet. There are hundreds of articles about you, cases you won, people you helped. Why did you never tell me?" I looked at him tenderly. "Because that was another life, son. When I retired, I wanted to be just your mother, just your children's grandmother. I did not want you to see me as the Iron Justice. I wanted you to see me as me. But you could have used that. You could have used your influence before. It does not work like that, David. Real power is not used to intimidate or to take shortcuts. It is used only when absolutely necessary, and it is used with surgical precision. For the past few days, I have been building something. A web of truths that will trap Chloe and her family in their own lies. And when she falls, she will fall completely." David took my hand. "I am scared, Mom. Scared to hope and lose again." "You are not going to lose," I told him with a certainty I felt down to my bones. "This time, justice will prevail. Because this time, I am here." That night, before sleeping, I took an old photo from my desk. It was of my grandchildren, taken last summer in my garden. They were smiling, their cheeks smudged with dirt and their hands full of flowers. Innocent, pure, deserving of a better future. "Soon," I whispered to the photograph, "everything will be okay." The next hearing was scheduled for 5 days later. 5 days that I used with the efficiency of a general preparing for the decisive battle. Every morning I woke before dawn, brewed my tea, and sat in my study reviewing every document, every photograph, every testimony my contacts had secured for me. The table was covered in meticulously organized folders, each labeled with precision: Salazar finances, Chloe medical history, teacher testimony, King investigation. Sam sent me daily reports with photographs attached. Chloe leaving expensive restaurants in the middle of the afternoon while her children were at school. Chloe at a luxury spa, spending what was likely the monthly salary of an average family. And the most revealing, Chloe yelling at her older son in the parking lot of a shopping mall, her face contorted in rage while the boy, my grandson, hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself invisible. That particular photo broke my heart. I printed it and placed it on my desk, looking at it every time I felt my determination waver. It was not revenge I was after. It was protection. It was justice for 2 children who deserved to grow up without fear, without anxiety, without having to walk on eggshells to avoid their mother's anger. Maxwell brought me more information on the lawyer King. Photographs of him dining with Victoria Salazar at exclusive restaurants, meetings that were definitively beyond professional. In one of the photos, taken from a discreet angle, Victoria was seen handing him a thick envelope. There was no way to prove what it contained, but the image suggested something that any perceptive judge would find questionable. I also discovered something interesting about the psychologists who had certified the children's well-being. Both received payments of $50,000 each, deposited into their accounts 1 week after issuing their reports. The payments came from a Salazar Motors corporate account, cataloged as consulting services. It was almost comical how careless they had been. The arrogance of believing their money made them untouchable, had made them sloppy. Caroline called me the night before the hearing. "Professor, Judge Vance contacted me. He asked for my opinion on the case, off the record. I told him I could not comment specifically, but I suggested he review any expert testimony presented by the plaintiff's side very carefully. I think he got the message. Thank you, Caroline. Your help has been invaluable. It is the least I can do, Professor. You changed my life. You taught me that the law is not just theory. It is a tool to protect those without a voice. Those children deserve to have someone protect them." That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake in my bed, watching the shadows the moon cast on the ceiling. I remembered other cases, other battles. The case of a single mother fighting a corporation that had poisoned her community's water. The case of an innocent man who had spent 12 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. The case of hundreds of workers exploited by an unscrupulous businessman. It had always been the same: David versus Goliath. The powerful against the vulnerable. And I had always chosen David's side, even if it meant making dangerous enemies, even if it meant living with security details and constantly looking over my shoulder. I had retired because I was tired of fighting, because I wanted peace, because after my husband died, I felt I no longer had the energy to continue being the tireless warrior I had been for decades. But watching my grandchildren suffer, seeing my son destroyed, I understood that true peace does not come from hiding from the world. It comes from knowing you did the right thing when it mattered. And this mattered more than anything. The morning of the hearing, I dressed with care. A pearl gray pantsuit, elegant but not ostentatious. A string of pearls that had belonged to my mother. My hair pulled back in an impeccable bun. I wanted to project authority, but also dignity. I did not need to intimidate with my appearance. My presence alone would do the work. David picked me up at 8 o'clock. He drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. I placed a hand on his arm. "Breathe, son. It is all going to work out. How can you be so sure? Because the truth always finds a way to come to light. And because this time, I am going to make sure it does." We arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. The building was imposing, with marble columns and a wide staircase. I had spent countless hours in places like this, but always on the other side. As a judge, as a lawyer, as the person controlling the process. Now I was just an observer, but that did not mean I was powerless. We climbed the stairs slowly. I no longer had the agility of my 50-year-old self. My knees protested with every step, but I kept my head high and my back straight. Inside the lobby, I saw Chloe and her family. Victoria was wearing an ivory-colored dress and jewelry that probably cost more than David's car. Chloe stood beside her, wearing a pale pink dress designed to make her look innocent and maternal. The lawyer, King, was talking with them, his briefcase in one hand and an expression of arrogant confidence on his face. When we entered, all heads turned. I saw King's expression change slightly, a small wrinkle of worry crossing his forehead. Chloe looked at me and quickly averted her gaze. Victoria, however, held my stare, sizing me up as if she could determine my worth just by looking at me. I smiled, a small, polite smile that did not reach my eyes. She frowned, clearly disturbed by my quiet confidence. We headed to the hearing room. It was smaller than I remembered, with dark wood paneling and high windows that let in natural light. Judge Vance had not yet arrived. I sat next to David at our table, placed my purse carefully beside me, and took out a small notebook and a pen. I was not allowed to speak as legal counsel, but no one could stop me from taking notes. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance. We all rose. Judge Vance entered in his black robe, his face serious and professional. His eyes found me immediately, and I saw him nod slightly in my direction. Acknowledgement, a silent greeting between colleagues. "Good morning," he said as he took his seat. We will continue with the case of Harrison versus Salazar. Before we proceed, I must inform you that I have exhaustively reviewed all documents presented, and I have some questions for both parties. The tone of his voice was different from the previous hearing. Firmer, more inquisitive. King seemed to notice it too, because he adjusted his tie nervously. Counselor King, the judge continued, in the previous hearing, you presented psychological evaluations certifying the emotional well-being of the minors under your client's custody. I would like you to explain the circumstances under which these evaluations were conducted. King stood up. Of course, Your Honor. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Ramirez. Shaw are highly qualified professionals who conducted comprehensive evaluations of the minors. And who hired these professionals? Mrs. Salazar, naturally concerned for her children's well-being. I see. And how much were they paid for their services? King hesitated for a second. Standard professional fees, Your Honor. Does $50,000 per evaluation strike you as a standard fee, Counselor? The silence that followed was deafening. I saw Clue stiffen in her chair. Victoria leaned her head toward King, whispering something urgently. Your Honor, King began, the doctors in question are renowned experts and, what concerns me, Counselor, is not their renown, but the objectivity of their evaluations when they are paid such considerable sums by one of the interested parties. Judge Vance looked at his papers. It has also come to my attention that there is a filed complaint made by a teacher at the children's school expressing concern for their emotional state. This complaint was not presented at the previous hearing. Why is that? King opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was Victoria who stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. That teacher was disgruntled because my daughter complained about her incompetence. The judge looked at her coldly. Ma'am, please take a seat. You are not permitted to speak unless called to testify. Victoria sat, but her face was red with indignation. Chloe looked smaller and smaller in her chair. I looked at Judge Vance, and in his eyes, I saw something I recognized immediately. The determination of someone who had discovered an injustice and was resolved to correct it. He had been my student, yes. But more than that, I had taught him that the law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to serve the powerful, and in that moment, I knew we had won. Not completely, not yet, but the scales had begun to tip. Judge Vance continued his meticulous questioning, and with every question, I watched as the perfect facade of Chloe and her family began to crack. King tried to defend every point, but his arguments sounded weaker and more desperate. It was like watching a house of cards crumble in slow motion. Counselor King, the judge said, reviewing another document. I see here that Mrs. Salazar reports an annual income of $200,000 as a corporate image consultant for Salazar Motors. Can you provide specific evidence of the work performed to justify this compensation? King cleared his throat. Your Honor, Mrs. Salazar advises on strategic marketing and brand representation decisions. Do you have specific contracts, work reports, documented projects? The silence filled the room again. Chloe was staring fixedly downward, her clasped hands trembling slightly on the table. Victoria had lost her arrogant expression and now looked worried, almost frightened. I will be requesting that documentation for the next session, the judge said firmly. Furthermore, I have ordered an independent evaluation of the minors, conducted by a court-appointed professional with no conflict of interest. I have also requested an interview with the teacher who filed the original complaint. I saw Chloe look up sharply at her mother. Victoria was shaking her head, clearly upset. The perfect plan they had built with money and lies was disintegrating before their eyes. The judge continued. I am also concerned about Mrs. Salazar's emotional stability. I have information that she was admitted to a rehabilitation center 2 years ago. Is this correct? Chloe shot to her feet so quickly her chair almost fell over. That is confidential. You have no right to mention that. Mrs. Salazar, sit down, the judge ordered in a severe voice. In custody cases, the well-being of the minors is the priority. Any relevant information regarding parental fitness can and must be considered. If you had addiction issues, it is pertinent to this case. Chloe sank into her chair, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. But they were not tears of remorse or vulnerability. They were tears of rage, of the frustration of someone used to getting their way and suddenly finding themselves trapped. King tried to intervene. "Your Honor, my client successfully completed her treatment and has been stable ever since. That will be determined by the independent evaluation I have ordered. Now, let us turn to Mr. Harrison." The judge turned to David. "Mr. Harrison, the accusations presented against you include job instability, lack of commitment to your children, and erratic behavior. Do you have evidence that contradicts these claims?" David stood up, his voice trembling but firm. "Your Honor, I have worked at the same company for 12 years. I have letters of recommendation from my employer. My children have always been my priority. I have attended every school event, every doctor's appointment when I was allowed. The accusations of erratic behavior are false. Do you have witnesses who can corroborate this?" "Yes, Your Honor. Their teachers, their coaches, neighbors who have seen me with them." The judge took notes. "Good. I order these testimonies to be presented at the next hearing." He paused and looked directly at me. "Justice Prescott, do you wish to add anything? Although you are not acting as legal counsel, your presence here is notable, and given your credentials, I would like to hear your perspective if you have anything to contribute." I felt all eyes fall on me. David looked at me with hope, Chloe with terror, Victoria with barely contained hatred. I rose slowly, taking my time, letting the silence stretch. When I spoke, my voice was calm but carried the weight of 4 decades of experience. "Thank you, Your Honor. I am not here as a lawyer, but as a grandmother concerned for the well-being of my grandchildren. Over these past months, I have watched how this legal battle has affected 2 innocent children. I have seen my son cry at night because he is denied the right to see his children. I have heard my grandchildren ask me why their daddy cannot take them to the park anymore." I paused, letting my words resonate. Justice is not about who has more money or better connections. It is about protecting the vulnerable. And in this case, the vulnerable are 2 children who deserve to have both parents in their lives, as long as those parents are capable of providing them with love, stability, and security. Judge Vance nodded slowly. "I agree completely, Justice Prescott, and that is precisely why this case will be reviewed exhaustively before any final decision is made." King stood up desperately. "Your Honor, this is clearly a case of undue influence. The presence of Justice Prescott is what, Counselor?" The judge interrupted, his voice sharp. "Reminding me that I must do my job with integrity? Are you suggesting that the presence of a distinguished professional prevents me from acting justly? Because if so, I invite you to file a formal motion for my recusal. But I warn you, such a motion will require evidence of bias, not simply the fact that someone is observing the proceedings." King turned pale and sat down without another word. Victoria leaned toward Chloe and whispered something urgently. Chloe was shaking her head, clearly panicking. The judge banged his gavel. "This hearing is suspended. We will reconvene in 2 weeks. By then, I expect to have the independent evaluation of the minors, the requested testimonies for Mr. Harrison, and the employment documentation for Mrs. Salazar. Furthermore, I want a complete report from the rehabilitation center where Mrs. Salazar was treated. If there are objections of confidentiality, they will be presented formally, and I will decide what is relevant to this case." He banged the gavel again. "Court is adjourned." We all rose as the judge exited. The moment the door closed behind him, Chloe exploded. "This is your fault," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You manipulated him. You used your influence to destroy me." I turned to her slowly. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "I have not destroyed anything, Chloe. You did that all by yourself. With your lies, with your manipulation, with your cruelty toward my son and my grandchildren. The only thing I have done is ensure that the truth comes to light." "You have no right," Victoria spat, stepping forward. "We are a respectable family. We have power, we have connections. This is not over." I held her gaze without blinking. "No, Mrs. Salazar, it is not over. But what you call power is nothing compared to the truth. And the truth is that your daughter is not fit to have sole custody of those children. The truth is that you used your money to buy false testimony. The truth is that you manipulated the system, believing you were untouchable." I took a step toward her, and I saw her instinctively flinch. "But there is something you should have investigated before starting this war, Mrs. Salazar. You should have found out who I really was. Because if you had, you would have known that I have spent my entire life confronting people just like you. People who believe their money places them above the law." I turned to David. "Let's go, son. We have a lot to prepare for the next hearing." As we walked out of the courthouse, I felt the gaze of Chloe and Victoria burning into my back, but I did not care. For the first time in months, I saw real hope in my son's eyes. The war was not over, but we had just won the first important battle. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of quiet, strategic activity. Every day I received calls, emails, visits from my old contacts bringing me crucial information. It was as if the entire network I had built over decades had reactivated all at once, each person eager to help the legendary Iron Justice on her return. Sam brought me more photographic and video evidence of Chloe with her children. In one particularly revealing video, my older grandson was seen leaving the house with his school backpack, his face etched with sadness. Chloe followed him, yelling something, her expression contorted with anger. The boy walked with slumped shoulders, defeated. It was heartbreaking to see, but it was necessary evidence. Maxwell obtained the complete records from the rehabilitation center. Chloe had been there not just for 30 days, as we initially thought, but for 45. She had relapsed during treatment, requiring additional intervention. The medical report mentioned episodes of uncontrollable anger and difficulty accepting personal responsibility. The document also recommended ongoing therapy and psychiatric follow-up, none of which Chloe had completed after leaving. The independent evaluation of the children was conducted by Dr. Selena Ortiz, a child psychologist with an impeccable reputation who had worked in custody cases for 20 years. Caroline had mentioned to me that Dr. Ortiz was known for her ability to connect with children and make them feel safe to speak honestly. I did not have direct access to the report before the hearing, but Caroline called me one night with unofficial information. "Professor, I spoke with a colleague who knows Dr. Ortiz." Without going into specific details of the case, she told me the report is very concerning regarding the environment in the mother's home. The children showed significant signs of anxiety when talking about their mother. We also gathered powerful testimonies in David's favor. His boss wrote a detailed letter describing my son as an exemplary employee, responsible and dedicated. 3 of his colleagues signed statements about how David constantly spoke of his children with love, how he requested time off for school events, how he genuinely cared for their well-being. The teacher who had filed the original complaint, a woman named Susan Miller with 30 years of experience, agreed to testify. I met with her in a discreet coffee shop. She was a woman in her 50s, with glasses and a warm but tired expression. "Mrs. Prescott," she said, holding her coffee cup with both hands, "I have seen thousands of children in my career, and when a child comes to class with fear in his eyes, when he flinches every time the phone rings because he is afraid it is his mother calling to criticize him, when he makes up excuses to stay later at school to avoid going home, it breaks my heart. Can you testify to this in court?" "Absolutely. I tried to before, but my complaint was dismissed. The Salazar family has a lot of influence in the school district. I received pressure from the administration to withdraw my concerns, but I will not stay silent if a judge is finally willing to listen." The days passed, and I felt stronger, more focused. It was as if the last 15 years of retirement had evaporated, and I had returned to being the woman I once was. My hands no longer trembled when I held legal documents. My mind worked with the clarity and speed it used to have. It was exhausting, but also invigorating. David came to my house every evening. We reviewed every piece of evidence together, every testimony. I explained the strategy to him, how each element would fit into the final hearing. For the first time in months, I saw him genuinely smile. "Mom," he said one afternoon as we had tea in my kitchen, "I do not know how to thank you. You have done more in 2 weeks than my previous lawyers did in months." "You do not have to thank me for anything, son. This is what mothers do. They protect their children and their grandchildren." I took his hand across the table. "But I want you to understand something. When this is all over, when you get your children back, my work will be finished. I will return to my quiet life. This is not a permanent resurrection of the iron justice. This is just one last battle." David nodded, but I saw sadness in his eyes. "Why, Mom? Why did you leave it all? You were so important. You helped so many people." I sighed, looking out the window toward my garden where the last rays of sunset painted everything gold. "Because there is a cost, son. A cost paid with years of stress, constant threats, always living looking over your shoulder. Your father died of a heart attack at 65. The doctors said stress was a major factor. He always worried about me, about the dangerous cases I took, about the powerful enemies I made. My eyes moistened with the memory. When he died, I realized I had sacrificed too much, that I had lost time with him, with you, by always fighting other people's battles. So I decided to retire, to seek peace, to be just Eleanor, not the justice, not the warrior, just me. Do you regret it?" "No," I answered immediately. "I do not regret helping all those people, but I do regret not finding a better balance. That is why, when this is over, I am going back to my garden, to my books, to my tranquility. This is an exception, not a permanent return. The night before the final hearing, I barely slept, not from nervousness, but from anticipation. I had prepared everything meticulously. Every document was organized. Every witness knew exactly what to say. I had anticipated every move King might make and had counter-arguments prepared for every scenario. I got up before dawn and went out to my garden. The air was cool, almost cold. I knelt beside my lavender plants, feeling the damp earth under my fingers. There was something profoundly comforting in that contact with nature, with something simple and real. "This is for them," I whispered to the morning stillness. "For my grandchildren, for all the times I was not there, for all the battles I stopped fighting. This is the last one, and I am going to win it." The sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was a new day, a day of justice. I showered, dressed in the same pearl gray suit I had worn before, and pulled my hair back precisely. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a 70-year-old woman. I saw Justice Prescott, firm, relentless, ready for battle. David arrived on time. We drove to the courthouse in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, charged with mutual trust. When we arrived and climbed those marble steps again, I felt invincible. Inside the courtroom, Chloe and Victoria were already there. They both looked tired, as if the last 2 weeks had been a torment. King had dark circles under his eyes, and his suit, though expensive, was not as impeccable as before. When we entered, Victoria shot me a look of pure hatred, but behind that hatred, I saw something else. Fear. She had finally understood that she was not fighting a harmless grandmother. She was fighting a force that had defeated enemies far more powerful than her. I sat down, opened my notebook, and waited. Judge Vance would be entering any moment, and when he did, the final act of this story would begin. Judge Vance entered with a thick folder under his arm, his expression grave and professional. We all rose until he took his seat. The silence in the room was so thick, I could hear my own breathing. This was the moment. All the work, all the preparation, all the pieces I had carefully moved for weeks converged on this final hearing. "I have exhaustively reviewed all the documentation presented by both parties," the judge began, his voice firm and clear. "I have also received the independent evaluation of the minors, conducted by Dr. Selena Ortiz. I must say, some of the findings are profoundly concerning." I watched Chloe tense in her chair. Victoria pressed her lips into a thin line. King tried to maintain a neutral expression, but his restless hands on the table betrayed him. The judge continued. "Dr. Ortiz interviewed both children separately, in a controlled and safe environment. Both minors expressed love for both their parents, which is positive. However," he paused, looking directly at Chloe, "both also showed significant signs of anxiety when discussing the routine at their mother's home." "That is a lie," Chloe shouted, abruptly standing up. "My children are perfectly fine with me." "Mrs. Salazar, sit down," the judge ordered in a severe voice. "This is your final warning. One more interruption, and I will have you removed from the courtroom." Chloe fell back into her chair, tears of rage streaming down her cheeks. Victoria put her hand on her arm, whispering something urgently. The older son, the judge continued, reading from the report, mentioned that his mother frequently yells when she is upset and that he tries to be very good so as not to make her mad. The younger child described feeling sad because he misses his father and does not understand why he cannot see him more. Both expressed a desire to spend more time with their father. I felt David choke back a sob beside me. I squeezed his hand under the table, offering him my silent strength. Judge Vance set the report aside and picked up another document. I have also received the complete report from the rehabilitation center where Mrs. Salazar was treated. Contrary to what we were initially informed, her stay was 45 days, not 30, due to complications during treatment. The report recommends continuous follow-up and therapy, none of which Mrs. Salazar has completed. Your Honor, King intervened, standing up, my client successfully completed her rehabilitation and has had no relapses. And how can you assure that, counselor? There is no evidence of medical follow-up. No therapist has certified her current stability. In fact, Dr. Ortiz's report mentions that during her interviews, Mrs. Salazar showed significant irritability and difficulty controlling her emotions. The judge picked up another document. Additionally, I have received the testimony of the teacher, Susan Miller, who expressed serious concerns about the older son's emotional well-being when in his mother's care. Mrs. Miller has 30 years of experience and is a respected professional. Her testimony cannot be ignored. I saw Victoria lean toward King, whispering frantically. King shook his head, clearly at a loss for how to respond. I must also address, the judge continued, his voice growing sterner, the financial irregularities that have come to light. Mrs. Salazar receives $200,000 annually as a consultant, yet there is no documented evidence of work performed. The payments of $50,000 to each of the psychologists who initially evaluated the children are, at a minimum, questionable. King stood up desperately. Your Honor, those are private financial matters that have no bearing on my client's parental fitness. On the contrary, counselor, they have every bearing. They demonstrate a pattern of using financial resources to manipulate narratives and buy favorable testimony. And that makes me question the integrity of the entire case presented by your client. The judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. Now, let us turn to Mr. Harrison. I have reviewed the letters of recommendation from his employer, the testimonies from his colleagues, the statements from his children's coaches and teachers. All of them concur in describing a dedicated, responsible, and loving father. I have not found a single piece of credible evidence to support the accusations of instability or negligence. David closed his eyes, and I saw his shoulders tremble slightly. I squeezed his hand tighter. Based on all this evidence, the judge said in a firm, decisive voice, I have reached a conclusion. The sole custody previously granted to Mrs. Salazar is hereby revoked. I am ordering equitable joint custody, with both parents having equal time with the minors. Chloe let out a strangled cry. No, you cannot do this. Furthermore, the judge continued, ignoring her, I am ordering Mrs. Salazar to undergo continuous psychological evaluation and therapy for the next 6 months. I am also ordering both parents to attend family mediation to establish effective communication protocols. And I want monthly reports on the children's well-being. The judge looked directly at me. Justice Prescott, although you are not officially acting in this case, I appreciate your presence. Your reputation for defending justice has been an important reminder of why we do this work, of why the law exists to protect the vulnerable, not to serve the powerful. I nodded slightly, feeling a warmth in my chest I had not felt in years. This court is convinced, the judge finished, that the best option for these children is to have equitable access to both parents, as long as both demonstrate capability and commitment to their well-being. Mr. Harrison, you have demonstrated that commitment. Mrs. Salazar, you will now have to demonstrate it as well. He banged the gavel. Judgment is entered. Joint custody is effective immediately. The sound of the gavel echoed in the room like thunder. David turned to me, tears streaming freely down his face, and hugged me tightly. We did it, Mom. We did it. Behind us, I heard sobs. I turned to see Chloe crumbling in her chair, her face in her hands. Victoria had her arms around her, but her expression of defeat was absolute. King was mechanically gathering his papers, avoiding all eye contact. I stood up and walked slowly toward them. Chloe looked up, her eyes red and swollen. For a moment, I did not see the manipulative woman who had hurt my son, but someone broken, lost. Chloe, I said softly, this does not have to be a defeat. You have an opportunity to be better, to seek the help you need, to learn to be the mother your children deserve. But that will only happen if you stop lying, stop manipulating, and start facing your own problems. She looked at me with a mixture of hatred and desperation, but said nothing. Victoria, however, glowered at me. This is not over, she hissed. I smiled sadly. Yes, Mrs. Salazar, it is. Because if you try to appeal this, if you try to use your money again to buy justice, I will be here. And believe me, now that the system knows I am watching, no one will dare give you preferential treatment. Your days of manipulating the system are over. I turned my back on them and returned to David, who was waiting for me with a smile that lit up his whole face. We walked out of the courthouse together, into the bright afternoon sun, and for the first time in months, I felt the world was in order again. Justice had prevailed, and I had kept my promise. 3 weeks after the ruling, I was in my garden as I was every morning, my hands deep in the earth, planting new basil seedlings. The sun warmed my back, and the scent of lavender drifted on the air. Everything had returned to the tranquility I had missed so much, but something was different. I was different. I heard laughter approaching and looked up. David was walking up the stone path with my 2 grandchildren running ahead, their faces lit up with genuine smiles. It had been so long since I had seen them like this, so free, so happy. "Grandma!" the eldest shouted, throwing himself into my arms. I did not care that my hands were dirty with soil. I hugged him tightly, feeling his small heart beat against my chest. The younger one joined the hug, and for a moment the 3 of us stayed like that, enveloped in silent love and gratitude. "What are we planting today, Grandma?" the little one asked enthusiastically. "Basil," I replied, smiling. "Will you help me?" We spent the entire afternoon in the garden. I taught them how to make little holes in the dirt, how to place the seeds carefully, how to water them without drowning them. They listened attentively, their small hands working diligently. David sat on the porch watching us, his expression serene and peaceful. There were no more shadows of sadness in his eyes, no more of that crushing weight of injustice. When the children grew tired and went to play on the old swing hanging from the big tree, David came over and sat next to me in the dirt. "They have changed so much in these few weeks," he said softly. "They are more relaxed, happier. The oldest is not having those nightmares he used to have, and the little one stopped asking me why he could not see me more." "Children are resilient," I replied, wiping my hands on a cloth. "They recover when given the right environment. Love, stability, security, that is all they need." "And Chloe, have you heard anything?" I nodded. "Caroline told me she started the court-ordered therapy. Apparently, she is being honest with her therapist for the first time. There is a long road ahead, but at least she is on it. I hope she makes it," David said sincerely. "Not for me, but for the kids. They deserve to have their mother, too, but a healthy version of her." I looked at him with pride. Despite everything he had suffered, he had not allowed the pain to turn him bitter or vengeful. He was still the good man I had raised. "And you, Mom?" he asked, turning to me. "How do you feel now that it is all over?" I reflected on his question as I watched my grandchildren play. "Tired," I admitted finally, "but at peace. I did what I had to do. I protected my family, and now I can go back to my quiet life, knowing I did the right thing. A lot of people have been looking for you, you know. Maxwell told me several of your former colleagues have asked if you would consider coming back as a consultant or an advisor. Your return, however brief, reminded many why they respected you so much." I smiled, but shook my head. "No, son. This was my last battle. I meant it. The Iron Justices is officially retiring now. I want to spend the time I have left here, in my garden, with my family. No stress, no enemies, no legal wars." David nodded, though I saw a flash of sadness in his eyes. The world lost a great defender when you retired. The world has many defenders, I replied softly. Young, energetic, full of passion for justice. Like you yourself could be, if you ever decided to change careers. He laughed. I do not have your talent, Mom. It is not about talent. It is about conviction, about knowing in your heart what the difference is between right and wrong, and having the courage to defend it, even when it is hard. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The children ran toward us, exhausted and happy. I am hungry, Grandma, the older one declared. Let's go inside, I said, getting to my feet with a small groan from my knees. I will make you my famous oatmeal cookies. That night, as I mixed the dough and my grandchildren watched me, perched on the kitchen counter, I felt a fullness I had not experienced in years. This was my true calling now. Not saving the world, but nurturing my small corner of it. Baking cookies, telling stories, teaching about plants, offering unconditional love. After David took the children home, I prepared my nightly chamomile tea and went out onto the porch. The night was cool and quiet. The stars shone brightly in the dark sky. I rocked gently in my chair, wrapped in a knitted shawl, and closed my eyes. I thought about all the battles I had fought during my life. The cases won, the lives changed, the injustices corrected. But this last one, this battle for my own family, had been the most significant of all, because it had not been for duty or profession. It had been for pure, simple love. Did I do right? I whispered to the universe, to my late husband, to anyone who might be listening. Was it worth breaking my promise of peace? The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the trees, and in that whisper, I found my answer. Yes, it had been worth it. Because some silences must be broken, some battles must be fought, and the love for one's family always, always justifies returning to war one last time. I opened my eyes and looked out at my garden, now bathed in the silvery light of the moon. The plants I had tended for years grew strong and beautiful, just as my grandchildren would grow now, strong and happy, protected by the justice I had fought to give them. I finished my tea, now cold, and went inside. I passed by my study, where all the case documents were still organized on my desk. Tomorrow, I would put them away for good. I would file them away with all the other memories of my old life. But tonight, I simply went to bed, satisfied and at peace. The iron justice had fought her last battle, and she had won. The next day, as I was packing all the documents into boxes for storage, I found the old photograph where I appeared in my robes, serious and powerful. I looked at it for a long time, remembering that woman I once was. Then, with a smile, I placed it in a frame and set it on my fireplace mantel. Not to glorify the past, but to remember that when it was necessary, when my family needed me, that woman returned. And she would do it again if she had to. Because some powers never truly die. They only sleep, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And I, Eleanor Mercedes Prescott, had awakened when it mattered most. Now, I could go back to sleep peacefully, knowing I had fulfilled my final purpose. I had protected those I loved. I had defended justice one last time, and that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. The seeds we planted that day with my grandchildren would eventually grow. The basil would flourish, and I would be here to see it, in my quiet garden, living the rest of my days in the peace I had sought for so long, because I had learned the most important lesson of all. True power is not in never retreating from the battle. It is in knowing when to fight and when to rest. And I, finally, had found that perfect balance.